Thanks to everyone for coming out and commemorating the life and career of Pat Gallagher, who was our longest serving faculty member. Pat Gallagher taught at Columbia and Barnard for a very, very, very long time, from 1961 to 2017, which is 56 years. I knew him for the last 19 of those years, and even that seems like a long time. So I will try to be brief. We've heard a lot about Pat's research career, and I gradually became aware of Pat's illustrious career in teaching, so that's what I will speak about. But Dorian Goldfeld, who's the real master of ceremonies, will take over after me, and he tells me that many other people want to speak, so I'll try to be brief, and I hope that they will also be brief. What I wanted to say was that I gradually became aware that during the entire time he was here, all of those 56 years, Pat really was the best teacher in the entire department. The most effective teacher, the most popular teacher, the most inspiring teacher. And it took quite a long time for that to become clear. But to convince you of the truth of this claim, let me read you the earliest review of Pat's teaching that I could find. This is from the Columbia Barnard course guide in the year 1970. And you see that there's an advertisement for the Symposium restaurant on the back. So some things never changed. Barnard professor Patrick Gallagher's course in number theory is a wonderful exception to the relatively uninspiring level of math at Columbia. Some things never change. Lectures stress theory and are extremely logical. Theorems are built on a strong foundation of definitions. Every step of a proof is carefully explained. Enthusiastic himself, Professor Gallagher adjusts his pace when he senses the class is not. He is very patient in explaining concepts and eagerly answers students' questions. So that was in 1970. Now here, somewhere, I have the teaching evaluation from the last course that Pat ever taught, which was Modern Analysis 1 in the fall of 2017. The professor is fantastic. His commitment to student learning comes across in everything he does. Professor Gallagher is one of the best professors I have ever had. There was never a moment when questions went unanswered. I love the guy. I think he is brilliant. It's amazing how constant this refrain is over the many, many years that Pat was teaching, the 56 years that he was teaching. He taught many, many different courses. He taught Calculus 1, 2, and 3. He taught Honors Math 1 and 2. He taught Complex Variables, Modern Algebra 1 and 2, Modern Analysis 1 and 2, Representations of Finite Groups, Introduction to Number Theory, Fourier Analysis, Ordinary Differential Equations, and probably more. For every lecture, he would hand out meticulous lecture notes in his spider-ink handwriting. And that was how I think his colleagues on the faculty became aware how much effort and attention he devoted to his teaching, and also of the huge diversity of the courses that he taught. Over an even longer period, I became aware of how many other things he did outside of the classroom to share his love of mathematics with a broader audience. Of course, he served for many, many years as the director of undergraduate studies. In that capacity, he made teaching assignments, but Pat would assign himself more than the standard teaching load, either because he perceived a need or just because he loved teaching so much. He also, without any fanfare, attended many, many meetings of the Undergraduate Math Society and spoke with undergraduates about their own presentations. He served on many dissertation committees on math education at Teachers College. He gave many professional enrichment talks to high school teachers. One of the assistant principals at Stuyvesant High School, Danny J., wrote this: "His professional development lectures deserve volumes of praise. They have raised the level of consciousness of many of the math faculty at Stuyvesant, who now present material employing a Gallagher strategy that intersperses historical anecdotes with mathematical concepts and applications." And one of the teachers who attended these lectures, Sheila Krylov, wrote the following: "It was the kind of presentation that made me wish I was a student again. He cast new perspectives on familiar material and made us all think at a higher level. He spoke about classical solid geometry, but he opened his talk with a letter written by Thomas Jefferson on the importance of mathematics in a free society." It turns out that in his lectures, Pat was fond of these somewhat dramatic, colorful gestures. One of his former doctoral students, Bill Charwitzo, remembered the following: "During the Vietnam War, Pat needed an example of a graph to illustrate some concept in his lecture. He pulled out a graph from a newspaper illustrating the number of casualties in Vietnam as a function of time. He identified the graph, and then he calmly proceeded to discuss the mathematics behind the graph without making any political statement. The huge room full of students was riveted by his presentation." So, the flair for the dramatic, colorful presentation was part of Pat's secret. And certainly meticulous, careful preparation was another. But I feel that those things, they added spice, they added content, but they weren't the real secret of why Pat was such a masterful teacher. What makes students say things like the following? I'll read you a few other testimonials. "Pat Gallagher is, in my opinion, the greatest professor in the math department and quite possibly the entire school. I personally love Professor Gallagher and would take any class he offered. His lecture is like an art. I feel like applauding." The theme that recurs from all of these many different classroom tales is that Pat's students not only learned volumes from him, and they revered him, and they admired him, but also they loved him. And why? What is the secret of that? I think the secret is, in fact, a very simple one. Because he loved them deeply and palpably. And loving your students is something that's very difficult to do. It's something that Pat managed to continually do for 56 years. So let me just conclude. Somewhere among these papers, I have a testimonial that was written by Owain Evans, who was an undergraduate here, when Pat was nominated for the teaching award, the Presidential Teaching Award that he received in 2005. Several students wrote testimonials about his teaching and his advising, and this one is particularly vivid, so let me share it with you. "In Gallagher's office hours, I learned much more than just mathematics. Just as he leapt from one branch of mathematics to another, he would swing between whole disciplines. Once, as I was wrapped in our discussion of James Jeans's writings on the musical scales of the ancient Greeks, Gallagher paused briefly. 'James Jeans, like Noam Chomsky, ends paragraphs with detonations,' he said. I didn't respond, but I glowed inside at the thought. On other occasions, we talked about logic and the foundations of mathematics, about the translations of Vietnamese popular songs into metrical English verse, about the great mathematicians and university life. When we talked about less technical subjects, I had the immense pleasure of feeling that we were thinking together on the question at hand, that we were investigating in concert. At these times, thoughts and questions flowed easily and richly. I felt invigorated, and my worries about time and inadequacy and homework dissolved. Professor Gallagher was friendly, enthusiastic, thoughtful, and witty. He was willing to speak on all sorts of topics, but he also listened carefully. He took a keen interest in music, philosophy, and poetry, but he seemed also interested in me and my life. And he dearly loved his subject, but he also loved to teach it. I realized the joy of talking to Gallagher and also the privilege. It was a privilege to interact with someone of such sagacity, such good humor, and such humanity, and it is something that I would long treasure. Thank you, and I next will introduce Dorian, Dorian Goldfeld, who, of course, was Pat Gallagher's own PhD student and has himself been a faculty member here for many years.
Gallagher had 23 PhD students and now has, today, I just looked it up, 156 descendants. I was one of those students. I first met him in the year 1967 when I was a senior in the engineering school at Columbia. And I want to tell you how I met him because I think it's an interesting story. I was a senior in the engineering school and not doing very well. I had about a C average. Put on probation one year. I took a course with Serge Lang, and I was working on a theorem. And one day I showed Lang this theorem. And Serge said, this involves stuff, you know, you're using analysis and other things that I'm not that familiar with. Let me show it to Lorch, and I'll see what he says. And then 2 days later, he calls me to come back. And he said, Lord said this is great stuff. And he said, who are you? I said, well, I'm in your class. And he looked me up and said, you're getting a C- in my class. I said, sure, because I was working on this theorem. And then he said, what are you doing next year? I said, well, I don't know. I'd like to go to graduate school in math. And Lang said, well, why don't you come to Columbia? And I was shocked because I applied all over the place and rejected everywhere. And anyway, I ended up being a graduate student at Columbia. And I thought I would work with Serge Lang. And when we started the next year, I said, you know, I'd like to work with you. What should I do? Anything you want to tell me? He completely blew my mind. He said, this year, I'm taking a break from math, and I don't want to talk about math at all. He said, go talk to Patrick Gallagher. So I went to Gallagher's office. He was at Barnard at the time. And he said, yeah, I heard about you from Serge. And then he just starts telling me about the Riemann hypothesis. He's all excited, telling me about the Riemann hypothesis. I vaguely knew what it was at that time. And then we started to meet regularly. Every time I met him, he said, can I show you what I'm working on? And he would show me all this stuff that you heard about today. The large sieve, the larger sieve, Bombieri sieve, all these things. And I took his course. I was in his course with Victor Miller, who's here, who'll say something later, was also a graduate student taking that course. It was probably the best course I ever took, so I agree 100% with what Michael Thaddus was saying before. At that time, Pat traveled a lot. Sometimes he would come back to Columbia wearing a helmet. I said, where have you been? He said, well, I go to these anti-Vietnam War rallies, and they're police with clubs, and they bang you on the head. He said, I wear this for protection. I was completely surprised. I had no idea that he would buy airplane tickets to go to rallies. Anyway, one day he came up to me. He said that Christopher Hooley just wrote a paper called On Arden's Conjecture. He said, you have to read this paper. Actually, I knew what Arden's conjecture was. This is not there are several Arden's conjectures. This is the one on primitive roots. Not that well known, but it was in Serge Lang and Tate wrote the collected works of Emil Arden. And in the introduction, there were they explained what Arden, so I knew what it was. And Hooley was proving it, assuming the Riemann hypothesis. But the Riemann hypothesis for Kummer fields, not the classical Riemann hypothesis. So I immediately got very interested in this. And I really tried to prove it, and I couldn't do it. I had many ideas, but I just couldn't do it. I thought I could replace the Riemann hypothesis with something else, but nothing seemed to work. But then in Gallagher's course, he was teaching Bombieri's theory. Bombieri proved the Riemann hypothesis holds in some average sense over progressions. This was discussed in the lectures today. And then I put 2 and 2 together. Okay, I can't prove Arden's conjecture, but maybe I can prove it on the average. Anyway, that was my thesis. I showed it to Lang. This was 1969. I started graduate school in 67. Lang said you can finish if you want. This is the thesis. And I made the biggest mistake of my life. I decided to finish. I didn't know much math. All I knew was what I learned in Gallagher's course. I didn't know much about topology. I didn't know much algebraic geometry. It was a big mistake, but I didn't know any better. And Lang was not very helpful in advising me. And Pat said I should finish. He thought I should finish. He said, you're ready to go out. So I did. I kept in touch with Pat all those years after that, and it was actually Pat who got me the job at Columbia. In the early 1980s, he told me, are you interested in the job at Columbia? And I said, sure. I didn't have a tenured position then. He said, it's going to take a few years. People have to get to know you. And he invited me to give talks, and over time, he managed to get me a job here. I don't know how he did it, but so anyway, now I'm a professor at Columbia. I just want to end with one thing. A lot of people want to say things, so I don't want to take too long. I noticed, I looked on the Math Archive. If people here don't know, what the Math Archive is a place, if you write a paper in math and you want everyone to see it, you put it on the Math Archive. But you have to be registered. I mean, someone who's not at a university can't put it on the archive. Anyway, on September 3rd, 2019, there was a new paper on the archive. So this is just a few weeks ago. And the paper is called Many Zeros of Many Characters of GLNQ. And the authors are Michael Larson, Alexander Miller, and Patrick Ximenes Gallagher. So posthumously, he just has a paper on